President Cyril Ramaphosa led the South African delegation as SADC leaders have descended to the Zimbabwean capital, Harare, to discuss critical matters facing the regional bloc. Peace and security top the agenda. SADC is concerned about instability in the eastern DRC.
The issues of peace and security of our region are still at the center of our attention, and are part of the priority issues of SADC, and we have made all necessary effort to maintain a climate of peace and tranquility in Southern Africa, which prevails, although we have some conflict in Eastern DRC, which is a challenge that we are trying to address, and we have good prospects.
Zimbabwean President Emerson Mnangagwa has also succeeded his Angolan counterpart, President João Lourenço, as SADC chair.
As I humbly assume this chairmanship of our august bloc SADC, I want to assure the people of our SADC region that Zimbabwe will continue to advance the cherished founding principles, the values, the goals and objectives envisioned by the great luminaries and the founding fathers of our region. A luta continua, victory is certain.
SADC has warmly received Namibian President Angolan Mbumba, who indicated they are ready for the upcoming elections.
Namibia is scheduled to hold presidential and National Assembly elections on the 27th of November this year. I am pleased to inform the summit that SADC Electoral Advisory Council has just concluded its goodwill mission to the Republic of Namibia, a nation that has enjoyed more than 34 years of peace and stability.
Meanwhile, SADC countries have been urged to boost trade amongst themselves, especially as the region seeks to industrialize.
As SADC member states, we are trading more with the rest of the world than we do amongst ourselves. One of the culprits, if I can call it, driving these low levels of intra-regional trade is the usual suspect, non-tariff barriers. I think the ministers of trade would relate with this one. Despite the zero import duty of 85% of products traded among the SADC member states, intra-SADC importers and exporters continue to encounter new and long-standing unresolved non-tariff barriers.
Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema, who's the former chair of the Organ and Politics, Defense and Security, skipped the session and sent his foreign minister as tension continues to rise between Harare and Lusaka. Khayelihle Khumalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Let's unpack this further now with journalist Hopewell Chin'ono. Hopewell, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. In the lead-up to the SADC summit, there has been protests outbreaks across various parts of Harare. Of course, the government, addressed that with full force, and there was relative silence and relative peace or non-protest in the last 3 days in the lead-up to the protest. How was that translated over into the weekend?
Well, there was massive repression in the past 62 days. President Mnangagwa and his government went after pro-democracy activists violating their human rights. We've got over 115 people that are in prison at the moment, pro-democracy activists. Some were tortured, some were beaten up. It was brazen, the whole world could see it, but the government doesn't care. And the peace and tranquility that you have been seeing on the streets of Harare has been enforced. There were trucks, military trucks, police water cannons, and in the townships, people were told to go home by 8 p.m. Shops were closed because the government was afraid that people might protest. The Constitution of Zimbabwe, Section 59, allows Zimbabweans to protest, but the Zimbabwean government has made it impossible for people to do this.
Now, of course, Zimbabwe isn't the only country that is of topical consideration at the summit. The presence and participation of Eswatini, for instance, very specifically around pro-democracy activists, is another consideration to be made. The question is, what is the journey going forward for pro-democracy activists across the SADC region as summits like these take place, as conversations like these take place about continuous democratization? I think it would be fair to say that there's no perfect democracy in the SADC region.
Ordinarily, citizens across the region should be allowed to protest because these are human rights that are underpinned by constitutions across the region. The only country that has allowed people to protest without incident is South Africa. The tragedy with Zimbabwe is that the protests are hinged on issues to do with economic issues. Zimbabwe is run by a corrupt government. Loads and loads of money are taken out of the country into tax havens, money that is meant to build hospitals, create employment. And it has created an immigration crisis not only in South Africa, but in the whole region. Zimbabwe has ceased to be a foreign policy issue in South Africa. It's now a domestic policy issue because a lot of Zimbabweans are coming to South Africa driven by this crisis for economic and political reasons. As I've always said, 70% of women giving birth at Musina Hospital are from Zimbabwe. This has been caused by the failure by the Zimbabwean government to implement programs that make sure that public services are working. Now, when things don't work, as I said earlier, we've got Section 59 in our constitution that allows us to protest and petition our government, but this is not allowed. Yeah. And we've seen it across the region in different parts of SADC. And I think it's important for SADC, if it wants to be taken seriously, to underscore the importance of citizens being allowed to do things that are underwritten by the Constitution. At the moment, it's not. So it has rendered SADC ineffective. It is now being seen as just an old people's home where they meet, they wine and dine, and that's the end of story.
Do they at all discuss the issues that you're raising? The heads of states attending the summit at the moment, do they at all discuss very specifically the issues of individual member states like Zimbabwe?
Well, one would have expected them to discuss these issues because they end up affecting other member states. As I said, South Africa is affected by the misgovernance in Zimbabwe. But yesterday, when they discussed the issue of elections, they said that the elections that took place in the last year in the region created wonderful leadership. And the wonderful leadership that they're talking about is people like Emmerson Mnangagwa, who has created an ongoing crisis that has seen so many Zimbabweans crossing into South Africa illegally and legally, looking for economic solace and running away from the political repression that's taking place.
And just lastly, issues of regional security include conversations around the mobilization of medical resources, like we saw President Ramaphosa calling for the mobilization of Mpox vaccines. There has been a previous collaboration during COVID among SADC member states. How much of the conversation around that is taking place at the moment?
Well, these are token conversations because if you go back to the COVID days, you will remember that I was thrown into prison 3 times by Emmerson Mnangagwa for exposing that him and his family were looting a COVID emergency fund that was meant to buy masks, that was meant to buy vaccines, but it was being looted by the president and his family. And when I exposed this as a journalist, I was thrown into prison 3 times. And the problem with not addressing these things at a regional level is that one country, and in this case South Africa, ends up carrying the burden of other countries. So, for instance, the same thing that is happening with maternal health, 2,500 women die every year giving birth in Zimbabwe. And because they are scared of dying, they end up going into South Africa, and South Africa ends up carrying the burden. So it's important for South Africa and the ruling party, ANC, and its coalition partners to understand that if these issues are not discussed at SADC level, they will end up having to carry the burden. And it creates social dispossession in a country, as we have seen in so many times in South Africa, where people end up going on the streets and demonstrating against foreigners. These are things that can be resolved by making sure that there is a standard the region in terms of how much is spent for health.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. That's journalist Hopewell Chin'ono.